I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Well, today's guest is Kim Colegrove, and Kim has a tragic story as well. Her husband was a first responder. He was a police officer for 30 years, and very sadly, after retirement, he took his own life. But what she has spent the last 9 years doing is taking what she learned and really trying to instigate change by making people talk and be open about when they're going through traumatic events, such as police officers do. So she's talking to us today, both about her experience, but more importantly about resilience and how you can find that strength to get through it. Look, Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Oh, boy. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And look, you do the work that so many of our guests do, and it's such an important message that, you can go through things that are difficult, but you have to find a way through, and you can do that as part of a community, and you do it together. And that's exactly what you've been doing. And I wonder if you could start off by talking to me, first of all, just about why you set up Pause First Academy.
It's a long and winding road, but the short story is that I lost my husband to suicide less than 3 months after he retired from a 30-year law enforcement career. And when my husband died, it was shocking beyond belief because he seemed ready to retire. Even though he had left the house every day for 30 years with a badge and a gun, he had a master's degree in business management, and business is kind of where his heart was. And so he spent the last 2 years of his career creating a business with a business partner, and he was set to roll out that new business. Outwardly, he seemed ready to retire. What I know now is that in that year leading up to retirement, so much of the pain and stress and trauma that he had held in, stuffed down, compartmentalized for over a 30-year career, I think started to just sort of rush to the surface, and he could no longer hold it in. He really needed to process it. And that's a long story about veterans and first responders who don't want to take that step to go get professional help for the mental and emotional piece. Typically, in my husband's case, he didn't want his employer to think anything was wrong with him or he was mentally unfit. So a few months after my husband died, I sat down. At first, it was just do the business, like just do what needed, kind of survival after you lose someone like that. And then I sat down and I allowed my mind to kind of just show me the picture of what had happened. I had avoided sinking down into it and remembering it or allowing it, but I knew that I needed to face it because I needed to understand how my husband had unraveled so completely and what just blew up my life in the way that it did. So that's really where this work started. I literally started mentally from the knock on my door, the uniformed police officer that came to give me a death notification. And that led me to mentally think about everyone who would have been involved in that call, the dispatcher, what a horrible call to get, the off-duty firefighter that heard the gunshot and found my husband in his vehicle, everyone dispatched to that call, the detective that had to come to my house and give me all the, pertinent information in that very business-like matter, because that's his job. And that is what led me on a journey of discovery about first responders and veterans and others, and what it is that they endure over a career. I learned how prevalent suicide is, and that's what made me want to do something to help. So I wrote a book. I eventually created Pause First Academy as a way to communicate to this population the importance of taking care of their mental and emotional health.
Yeah. When you are looking to help other people, and let's take your husband, for example, do you think, would you have liked him to receive some kind of emotional training before he even entered the service? Or would you have liked that to continue throughout? Or would it have been after specific events, traumatic events that happened? Like there's so many points which I can think of when you could need training. Do you suggest all of those?
All of the above. And it's really what I and a lot of other people are advocating for. I have a team of instructors now that I work with. They're all veterans and first responders themselves or retired first responders.
That must help a lot.
Oh my gosh, they bring the validity to these trainings. Yeah, because they've done the work. Yeah, it helps a ton. And, we all feel the same. This needs to be offered in the academy training, in boot camp, like whatever is that first training, the mental and emotional piece. Not just you're going to see and endure a lot of bad things, not just that. You're going to see and endure things. And when that happens, here's a toolkit. Here's how we want you to address that and take care of your mental and emotional health. That needs to be offered right up front. And just as you said, as you move through the career and you encounter those critical events, it needs to be an ongoing support, just like you would support their physical health. Yeah.
Let's start off with the ones at the very beginning, because it's so hard to prepare. Now, I've been through some traumatic events. I was badly injured, and I just wonder, how do you prepare someone to go through something, to experience something traumatic until they've actually seen it? What's the point by point? What do you do?
Yeah, that's really tricky. Our approach to teaching resilience to people, the first step is, learning to prepare for. So that is just developing skills and tools, adopting practices that can help you strengthen your resilience ahead of time. So that's a whole kind of training piece that we introduce people to. How can you prepare? Life is going to throw stuff at you, and especially in this profession. And how can you, prepare for that?
Is that to very literally to say to someone, when something traumatic happens, you must, and I don't know the answer, not overreact. You must take a step back. You must picture that in the way. Like, what are the actual specifics that how you could prepare someone?
Yeah, for this particular population that we primarily work with, which I call them warriors. I include first responders, veterans, and there are other surrounding professions like social workers, parole and probation, correctional officers. There's a whole surrounding, a lot of surrounding professions. The main thing for this population is to not think that you are supposed to endure a horrible, terrifying, traumatic event and then just carry on. That's been the status quo for a very long time. This is hard work. You're going to see bad things and you just carry on. Suck it up, buttercup. That's a term they've used for a long time. So I would say that's probably the initial encouragement is you can't just move on, because you don't actually just move on. It builds up. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Your husband, I know, he had very early on in his career, he was involved in an incident during a shooting and someone died. And I think if you've pointed perhaps to even then, that one point, remind me what happened, because he was sent home, everything was fine, and then he just went back to work one day.
Yes. So there's this whole other piece that we talk to people about too. So I'll throw this in here too. And that is individuals who also potentially experienced childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. So there was some of that for my husband in his younger days.
Can I ask what that would have been?
Well, he was raised in a law enforcement family, grandfather, dad, two uncles. So, to say his father was not probably very, touchy-feely on the emotional, because that's just how they're built and that's how they operate. And when he was 16 years old, he was in a very bad car accident, and one of his closest friends was killed in a very horrific way that I won't even explain. So there were just some things like that from his youth that he drug into a profession that would inevitably expose him to a lot more trauma. And that shootout that you're referring to, that occurred in his very first year as a police officer in a one-man patrol car when he was 21 years old. And he was driving on his route, his beat, and he started to get shot at in his patrol car. And so that led to, him doing everything he'd been trained to do, exiting the car and taking cover and firing back. He ended up shooting and killing the individual. And to your point, he was called back to the station. They took his badge and gun. They sent him home. They told him there would be an investigation. He's 21. He's a new police officer. He's living alone. So there's just a pile of traumatic events that happened there. Being shot at, fearing for your life, taking a human life, being stripped of your badge and gun, which is, you have to have those to do your job, after doing what they had trained you to do in the line of duty, and then being isolated for a good period of time and not knowing what your future held. And then when he did get that call, you've been cleared. There's been an investigation. You've been cleared. Come on back to work. He went back to work. They gave him his badge and his gun. He went to roll call right back in a one-man patrol car. No debrief, no conversation, no therapy, no intervention of any kind. And those kind of incidents are unfortunately very common and prevalent across these professions historically. But imagine how much damage that does to an individual mentally and emotionally.
Yeah. Would he have talked about sort of, I'm certain there were many more events throughout his career, of similar, equally bad. And I wondered if he would ever come home and talk to you, even if though he wasn't talking to anyone at work.
He talked a little bit about some of the stories, a little bit, but he did, and I think this is common too. They don't want to, for lack of a better term, kind of trauma dump on their people close to them. So, and a lot of times, you want to come home and
forget it. You want to come home and perhaps be in a world where that doesn't exist, but by not allowing it in, it starts to create other problems.
You got it. That's it. For the most part, I think people in these professions don't go home and tell a bunch of difficult stories. They may speak about it a little bit with people they work with, and sometimes they don't even do that. It's over, and they stuff it down, and they move on.
What should people be watching for? If you are surrounded or you're close to someone who has a job that can be traumatic, first responder, what should you be watching for, and how can you help?
The individual themselves, or their family members and friends, or either or.
The individual themselves.
The individual themselves.
So with your husband, for example.
Yeah, there are so many.
Yeah.
There are so many red flags that people ignore. So wanting to isolate, increasing alcohol use or prescription or non-prescription drug use, anxiety, depression, insomnia and other sleep problems. There's a long list of very obvious red flags that, because of the profession they're in and because they don't want to show weakness, they ignore and they just keep pushing through. So that would be my first counsel, would be, if you recognize some of these in yourself and behaviors that you maybe didn't partake in 5 years ago, you start to notice these, just to overlook them and to keep powering through, that's not sustainable.
Yeah. You're listening to Searching for Heroes with Benjamin Hall. We'll be right back. It's interesting because I talk about resilience quite often, and these first responders, on one level, have more resilience than anyone. They are facing traumatic events eye to eye. They're charging down the bad guys. That's resilience. And it's always interesting to me to think that sometimes, in one sense, the most resilient person might inside not feel resilient at all. I wonder if you'd ever thought about the two sides of jobs that first responders have.
Yeah, for sure. There's always this external. I mean, I'm talking traditionally. It's starting to change a little bit. It's getting a little bit better. The mental and emotional support for these people is improving. But traditionally, it was really kind of that John Wayne approach. Honestly, it was that just tough exterior. And as long as they were able to hold up that facade and that tough exterior, at least at work and around their peers, that was their survival mode, and they could be completely falling apart on the inside. And I've said, in the last year of my husband's life, he worked 2 massive federal cases. He was a federal investigator for the last 22 years of his career. He was a police officer for 8 years and a federal investigator for the last 22 years. He worked 2 big federal cases, and he could keep those cases straight and go to work, and nobody would know there was anything wrong. But when he came home is when he went unravel. That was his safe space. So what you saw at work and what you saw in federal court it was not what was going on inside of him, but he was able to do that for a certain number of hours of the day. And then when he came home, that's when I started to see kind of the unraveling, the anxiety, the different things increasing. So I think a lot of them do that. And unfortunately, alcohol use is prevalent. So you go to work and you get through your shift, you get through your day, and then you go home and drink or use medications to kind of numb out and try and get a little bit of sleep, and then you're right back at it.
Goodness, I can't help but think that it's not just your husband and first responders who are going through difficult things. It's family members as well. It's yourself, and I guess many times you're forgotten. Family members are forgotten as well. And
Yeah.
how's this been like for you? Where do you find the strength to do this?
Well, so my husband passed away in 2014. It's been 9 years, and I reached out for support. I've had therapy. I have a lot of good friends. For sure, doing this work has been cathartic and helpful and healing for me. The spouses get left out of the conversation, and that's something that I and the other instructors that I work with, we're trying to turn up the volume on that conversation as well. And I'm trying to create more opportunities on Pause First Academy for spouses to come and learn what we teach about, which is we teach about trauma and secondary trauma, which is being exposed to and impacted by the trauma of others, which is huge. And we teach a lot about resilience and how we can strengthen our own resilience, and just the spouses being able to understand kind of maybe what's going on with their spouse mentally and emotionally, because a lot of the spouses don't really understand what the work is or what their spouse sees. As an emergency medical professional or as a firefighter, because again, those professionals don't come home and tell all the war stories.
Yeah.
So, but over time, what happens is they just start acting differently. They start to isolate. They withdraw from the family. They don't want to go to family events anymore. They're depressed. They're anxious. They're not sleeping well. It's just, there's a lot of commonalities in these marriages and families, and the spouses and the families absolutely suffer if there's no intervention.
Yeah, it's funny because I've covered conflict for 15, 20 years, and for a long time I would come back from war zones, and just as you said, I would want to leave that behind. I would want to come back to my wife and just to that life. And you didn't want to bring it with you. And it was only after the attack and my own injuries that I think I started to become more open and honest about all the things that we'd seen. And I think it's really lifted something by being able to do that. You talked about strengthening people for strengthening their resilience. How would you go about helping someone strengthen their resilience?
Well, there are so many skills and tools and practices that people can use, preemptively. So, even though I work with veterans and first responders and retired first responders, all of them have mental and emotional wellness practices that used to be considered kind of new agey or, kind of out there, but have become more mainstream, like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, things like that, but also taking care of your physical body. There just are a lot of components and a lot of different practices and skills that we can teach. And we recommend people start to integrate those tools into their life preemptively, just like, you don't just go and exercise and get fit, before an event like a wedding or something. It's better if you exercise regularly and keep your body healthy and fit, as you move through life. So you can kind of think of your mental and emotional health in the same way. It's consistency with these practices. But the other piece is just understanding what trauma is, what it does to the brain and the body, how it impacts people, understanding what resilience is and what it means, and discovering how resilient you are or are not naturally, and then finding those tools and skills that can help you develop more resilient behaviors. Something as simple as understanding what self-regulation is, emotional regulation or self-regulation.
What is this when you say self-regulation?
Self-regulation. So the ability to regulate one's own nervous system and regulate one's own emotions. So instead of going through life and being habitually reactive anytime you encounter a threat or a traumatic event or a stressor, to learn that you have the ability to develop regulation skills that help you not only regulate your nervous system, so kind of slow down your heart rate, take a beat, take a pause, but it empowers you to be a more responsive human being rather than just constantly reactive. So that's the whole learning curve for people, but it's empowering. Like these are just personal practices, powerful personal practices that you don't have to join the club or spend any money. You can read books and listen to podcasts and learn, and then implement those resilience building practices into your life. And that is part of how you can prepare for traumatic events or for bad things to happen in your life. I loved your podcast, the episode you did, where you talked a lot about resilience and is it nurture, is it nature?
I was just going to ask you.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you first of all how you would define resilience.
Well, we have kind of a stock definition that we use, and I'll give you kind of a version of it. It is the ability or the capacity to prepare for and grow through and survive and deal with adversity. So it's a person's capacity to do that. And I do believe some people are maybe naturally born more resilient than others. I believe there are things that we might encounter or experience in our childhood that might either increase or reduce our resilience later in life. But I really do believe that resilience can be taught and learned and increased or strengthened.
You said just there, grow through something traumatic. So it's not just being able to put up with something traumatic or deal with it. It's potentially trying to even get stronger when you deal with something traumatic. So many people think of something terrible happening to them and it puts up a wall and all they've got to do is try and get through it. But I suppose another way of thinking about it, and you've just said it, is maybe use traumatic events to get stronger, to become stronger, to learn new things, and you come out the other side feeling even more resilient.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think we can learn from these events. I think we can learn more about ourselves from these events by examining what our reaction was, how we felt about it. I mean, typically that's probably going to take at least talking to somebody, a friend or a mentor, if it's not a therapist or a counselor, being able to kind of, bounce it off of somebody. But I think we can learn from these events and, then start to find our skills or our tools that work for us. And then that might help us prepare, which was the first part that I mentioned, prepare for the next adversity that we might encounter. It's absolutely worth the effort of at least educating ourselves about this and understanding it, because what's really sad, and what I've learned in doing this work, is that there are a whole bunch of us who did experience adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma. And we carry that into adulthood, but it's unconscious. We don't realize how much those adverse childhood experiences impact us in adulthood and inform our behaviors and inform our decisions. So education is just huge, to educate people about this and then offer them skills and tools to help them, strengthen their resilience. I've just recently joined, I'm so excited about this. I've just recently joined a planning committee for my local county, and we're really focusing on community resilience. So it's the director of my local mental health, community mental health center, a couple of prominent, business owners. There's 5 or 6 of us, and we're having our first ever workshop at the end of this month. And we're just going to focus on this very thing. Turning up the volume on the conversation around adverse childhood experiences, trauma. What is trauma? How does trauma impact individuals and our community? And what we can do to help our community become more resilient, down to each individual, and then therefore, live in a more resilient community. I know this sounds like a huge undertaking, but I'm just really excited to jump into this, because this is what will start to change and improve things for people. It's the education, getting underneath and educating the population, and then helping, and then just developing more resilient individuals one by one.
Totally. It's not about a man and his wife, his family. It's about community. I think we forget sometimes how important the whole community can be. And when you're in the middle of a community, you feel you can talk to other people. People can watch you and be close to you. So I totally agree. It's really powerful. Have you got any children?
I do. I have 3 adult children. They're 33, 28, and 23.
Can I ask, after your husband took his own life, what your discussion was like with them and how you have now sort of talked to them about what happened and the future and resilience?
Yeah, so David was my second husband, and he was a stepfather to my 3 children. My youngest daughter, he was in her life from when she was 6 years old, and they had lived together and were very close. It was unbelievably devastating for everybody. Suicide is a particularly devastating. I'm not saying it's worse than anything else, but it's just unique in some ways. When someone you love chooses to take their own life and leave. So yeah, it opened up a whole. Unfortunately, also we had what they refer to, or what some people refer to as a copycat suicide. We had a second suicide in our family just 7 months after my husband died.
I'm sorry.
And so that it did open up the channels to have lots of conversations over the years with my children about their mental and emotional health and taking care of themselves. Yeah, that was a whole, other piece to this tragedy and this loss was, I can say for like myself and my husband's sister, Julie, his sister and his best friend, I've never seen a sibling relationship closer than theirs. She and I, and all of us, we were then constantly afraid that anyone in our life who was ever sad or depressed or anxious or had any mental health or emotional health, we were so afraid everybody was going to take their own life. It's been an unbelievable impact on the family as a whole.
More of our conversation right after this. I wonder if you look at now sort of, say inside the police, how much change you're seeing there, like what actions they are taking to provide this kind of some of the perhaps training that you wish that David had.
Yeah, I think it's increased and it's improving fairly rapidly. I mean, we're nowhere near where we need to be, let me say that. But when my husband, when I recognized that my husband needed mental health attention, we did put him on the traditional mental health track. And that did not help him, and that wasn't going to help him for multiple reasons that I won't go into.
What is the traditional track?
The traditional psychiatric track. He ended up going through the ER because he was having panic attacks, and then that led him to psychiatric care with a psychiatrist. And he did give it he did give it an effort. He gave it a try. He was willing to try. But for law enforcement specifically, and honestly, sometimes that even includes military and other first responders, sitting in group therapy with citizens that they may have encountered, it's just doesn't work for a lot of them. That's a whole other it's a whole other podcast if we went into the psyche behind that. But I believe, just for my husband and for my life, what might have made the difference for him would have been some of these first responder specific or, group counseling or group therapy or the programs that are really created for and built for this population.
Like Pause First Academy.
Well, Pause First Academy, we do kind of that. We're definitely not for people in crisis. But there are programs that I've worked a lot with, one locally here in the greater Kansas City area called The Battle Within. And they do a 5-day group therapy program for veterans and first responders specifically. The curriculum was created by a combat veteran who is now a clinician. It's mentored by veterans and first responders. It's got clinical oversight. But it's specific to this population because they are different. They are a unique population. Mm. So I can tell you from my own personal experience, in the past 9 years, the awareness of the mental and emotional health of our first responders and support systems and programs has skyrocketed from what it was a decade ago. And I think that's going to continue.
Yeah. I think, Kim, just to finish up, I wondered if there's a lesson that you really want listeners to learn, and that the people who come, to Pause First Academy learn as well. What is the real message that you want to send out that people should hear about?
Well, if people are listening and they do work in one of these professions that I'm talking about, as a first responder, dispatcher, correctional officer, any of those, social worker, any of those surrounding professions, or active military or a veteran, I would just say you deserve to live and work and retire healthfully. Please, please don't overlook your mental and emotional health. That first step is the hardest step. It gets easier from there. And then to other people that, don't work in these professions and maybe don't understand the world, I would say the same thing. This is a conversation that should have been had decades ago about trauma and surviving trauma, what resilience is, what makes a resilient individual. So for all of us to be happier and healthier and to live and work and retire healthfully, we've got to focus on our mental and emotional health. So that really is my primary message, is the importance of not overlooking your mental health and your emotional health. It's right up there with your physical health. It's all connected. You can't separate them out.
Yeah. And Kim, I know that's exactly what you do day in, day out, is try and help others. And so I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for speaking to me, and go and keep doing the amazing, amazing work that you do every day.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. Well, I think Kim she put so perfectly, how I feel, and how so many people that I have worked with and encountered and come across during my own recovery have felt as well, that by talking to people, by addressing some of these issues, that's the way to get through it. And what I loved with her, what she said in the middle there, was that not only do you have to get through something traumatic, but you can grow through something traumatic. And I just think we've always got to remember that. But also we've got to remember first responders, all those people at the front lines. They don't just go through one traumatic event. They go through multiple traumatic events, one after the other after the other. It is in the nature of their job. And as Kim said, when they're doing the jobs, they have to be able to put their feelings aside. And that's how I felt as a war correspondent. You have to put those feelings aside so you can do the job, but you mustn't hide those feelings. You must come back to them and address them and talk about them. And I honestly think she's right in saying that. And that you become mentally strong by being physically strong. And again, something I want to look into a little bit more in this podcast is how the mental and the physical work together. Healthy person is more mentally strong. There's no doubt about it. I've seen that firsthand myself. So what a great interview. I'm so glad that you could join us today. I'm so grateful that Kim could join us as well. And looking forward to speaking with you all next week. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.